So now that we know how to write the formulas for our binary ionic compounds, we need to know how to name them. So when we talk about naming, that's when you're having a conversation with someone and you need to say what you're trying to say. So I have the notes pulled up for our naming ionic compounds. So there are a few steps you have to take to name these because they are named in a very, very specific order. So typically you'll start with the cation name followed by the anion name. So remember, cations are going to have that positive charge, anions are going to have that negative charge. So when we're dealing with monatomic cations, so this is what we've talked about so far. We'll get into multivalent compounds as well as polyatomic compounds later. But for now, when we're talking about monatomic cations, so what we've been dealing with, you use just the element name. So say we had sodium. So sodium plus, and maybe we had it paired with Cl. So we have sodium and chlorine. So it says for monatomic cations, you would use that element name. So we just have to use sodium. Now for the monatomic anions, you have to use the root of the element plus the suffix "ide." So suffix means that you're going to attach that at the end. So if we're using chlorine at the end, we'll start with the root, which is chlor, and we're adding IDE at the end, so chloride. And that's all there is to it. So this little diagram on the on that right-hand side is going to explain in a more visual way what you're supposed to do. So when you're naming your ionic compounds, it's always the name of your cation first, then your anion, so your metal or your non-metal. Then if you're doing your cation, if only one possible charge, so those are our monatomic cations, sorry, you'll use just the element name. And then this part we'll talk about later. If you have your anion, if the compound is binary, which is what we've been talking about, you use the element name and change the ending to "ide," which is exactly what we did. So we're going to do example number 2. So 1 and 3 are done for you. That's because those are examples of our multivalent compounds and our polyatomic compounds. So we're going to talk about that later. So for now, we'll just have those filled in. But for our number 2, it's asking what is the name for the compound CaCl2. So usually we start with the name of the cation followed by the anion. For the monatomic cation, you use the element name. And then for our anion, you use the root of the element plus the "ide" at the end. So I'm going to pause for a second, try to do this, and then we'll come back. Okay, so for that first one, we have Ca, which is going to be calcium. So that second part, for our anion, we are using the root plus adding "ide." So Cl is chlorine, but we're only using the root, so CHLOR, and then we're adding "ide" at the end. Okay, so now that we know how to name, we'll do a little bit of practice. And then for our next thing, we'll talk about multivalent compounds.